You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hello, I'm Keri Wong. I'm an assistant professor here at the IOE. In this episode, I'm delighted to be talking with Dr. Ruanni Tupas. Ruanni is a lecturer in applied linguistics and part of the Center for Applied Linguistics, based at the IOE. He also holds an assistant professorship at the English Language and Literature Academic Group of the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Ruanni is an international speaker, book author, and multi-award teacher known for his contributions to improve the quality and impact of our education system for the future. He is currently a member of the Advisory Board of Language Teaching, Board of Reviewers of Malaysian Journal of ELT Research, and the Editorial Board of Asia Pacific Education Researcher. For more than 2 decades, Ruanni's work has focused on teacher education. He is well-traveled in Southeast Asia, especially the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand, and has worked extensively in Singapore's teacher education and curriculum development during his tenure. Ruanni has undertaken research and teaching that centers around the inequalities of multilingualism and has found creative new ways to engage with the public, including interviews with young Filipino music fans and curated articles on his blog. We are delighted to have Ruanni here today to learn more about his research on teacher education, his travels in Southeast Asia, and involvement with Filipino pop music. Hello, Ruanni. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Keri. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm excited to be talking with you.
Welcome, welcome. My first question to you is, what made you get involved in education? I think from your notes, you've come from a family of educators, correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, practically everyone's an educator, from my grandparents down to my mom. So it really runs in the blood. But I myself got interested in it because of my work in the University of the Philippines from college, and from then on, it was no turning back. It has always been education.
That's amazing. Sounds like a true passion of yours. I guess then how specifically did you get involved with languages and linguistics? Which languages do you speak?
Well, I mean, I'm from the Philippines, so we are generally multilingual speakers. And so much of my interest in language studies has primarily been always personal, because I come from a province in the Philippines where many languages are spoken. Aside, of course, from English and the national language, which is Filipino, I also speak a couple of other Philippine languages. My mother tongue is Aklanon. I am also fluent in the original language, which is Hiligaynon. And because of that, it is my experience speaking these different languages that has somehow pushed me to think about the theories that I learned in college. For example, I have been, in a sense, uncomfortable with the theories of language or the nature of language that I learned in college, because they didn't seem to speak to me as a multilingual speaker of from the Philippines. And that basically started my interest, how my own experience and how the multilingual experience of Filipinos can feed into what we learn about languages.
That's really fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. So, I understand that you've worked in Singapore, you did your PhD there. So, what are some of the differences that you see between Asia and the UK in terms of teacher education? How about it when it comes to learning English?
Well, quite. Fascinating differences, but I consider these differences always as learning points for me as a teacher and as a person, in general. In Singapore, teacher education, of course, there is one teacher education institution in Singapore. So there is a high level of collaboration, if you call it that, between what we do in the classroom, in other words, teachers in the classroom, and teachers in, let's say, local institutions such as the elementary or basic education institutions, as well as government policymakers, as well as the Ministry of Education. So it is always that triumvirate of groups of people who are involved in the teaching of students, of our students. So there is the challenge is how to basically bring together different voices from these group of people who are involved in education. My experience in the UK, of course, I definitely cannot generalize it at this point because my experience is with the Institute of Education, so of UCL. In a sense, there is a little bit more room for individuality in terms of the content of your course, of your modules, being able to design or redesign your lessons in a way that you probably might find interesting or relevant to your own students as well. So, in other words, the kind of collaboration of curriculum development that you are involved in is at the level of the institute. Whereas in Singapore, my experience is the kind of collaboration that you are engaged in has to be beyond the institution, be beyond the teacher education institution. So you have to be working with a couple of other stakeholders in education, which also brings in or brought in a lot of other challenges, but fascinating challenges that is, of course. But some similarities, students, because they are all in the field of education, the passion is there, the questions are there. I mean, these similar questions, basically, I back in Singapore, in the Philippines, and here, the kinds of language issues generally are similar because students face these issues in their respective classrooms as well. So, yes, there are differences, but in terms of classroom experiences, there is definitely a lot of dialogue there between these groups of students and groups of teacher educators.
It sounds like you're drawing your experiences across cultures, and then perhaps all of that informs your way in which you're teaching and conducting teaching as well in the classroom and outside of that. I know that you do, spend a lot of time in Southeast Asia. It means that you can access places very easily. I know you've spent a good, long time traveling across Southeast Asia as well and working with teachers and students across different aspects of practice or curriculum development. What were some of your most memorable moments being in the field?
Oh, yeah, oh, definitely. Actually, traveling outside, my formal institution has always been some of the most exciting parts of my career back in Singapore and in Southeast Asia. It's deeply multilingual and also deeply multicultural. So even within particular countries, you get to be immersed in different cultural, groups as well. I guess the most fascinating experience to me, I mean, it's really not one particular moment, but the fascinating part of my experience traveling Southeast Asia because of my work is to really just simply spend time with teachers and students. You spend time not, and you spend time with them not in the classroom, but you spend time with them outside the classroom. They pick you up in your hotel or hostel. You ride in the motorcycle. They bring you to their own their own homes, introduce you to their own families and children as well. It is that kind of interaction, I think, that is to me very, very memorable because you get to know what's behind, the history and the stories behind these teachers and the students. Because a lot of time when we do research, we go into the classroom, we observe what they do, we make comments on what they do and the classroom practices, but very little time is spent really knowing more about the students and the teachers, because after all, these are everyday ordinary people who also have to work on other things in life. After classes, they go home to, they go to the market to pick up, to buy vegetables and cook. And then so they ask you to join them for lunch at home, and then you go back again to their classes and to their offices. It is this part, I think, to me, that has enriched my experience as a researcher, because you get to know them more as human beings and the struggles that they go through in life, other than just simply being teachers and students in our research.
Yes, I agree. I definitely agree with what you are saying and relate to that. It's almost like you're contextualizing them and their experiences as well by understanding a bit more about their normal life, right? Because they're just like all of us. And through your, what you just described,
Yes. If I have to add to that, it is these experiences, the enriching experiences that have actually fed back into my work as a researcher. It is these, information and knowledge about colleagues in the region that somehow have pushed my own theorizing in the field as well. Most of the time, or a lot of times, we do come around to go around with our own theories, with us using them to try to understand others. But my own experience is being immersed in with the lives of your own colleagues and your friends and students in the region. They actually help you rethink your own stand and position, your own thinking about languages, your own thinking about education. And I think that, to me, has made my work more appropriate in terms of its relevance to the region and to my own experiences as well.
can you describe that a little bit more? Does this personal experience and interaction inform kind of your ideas about inequalities of multilingualism? Can you tell us a little bit about what that really means?
Yes, definitely. Well, I have my work has always revolved around inequalities of multilingualism, and whether I would do language policy or classroom discourse analysis, or whether I do literacy development, or even TESOL, or teaching of English as a second language, all of that still addresses or attempts or aims to address inequalities of multilingualism. The idea behind inequalities of multilingualism is really basically the fact that when we talk about multilingualism, we simply just don't talk about languages that are distributed within communities. We talk about multilingualism in these terms. There are many languages in this community, there are many languages in this nation, in this country. That's multilingual, but that's only half of the story. The other half of the story, which I think is more important and more critical, is that these languages are valued differently. And because these languages are valued differently, and not everyone in the community, not everyone in the country, or in a particular context, for example, has access to the languages that can give them, certain privileges in their society, then that's where inequality comes in. That's where the use of one language over another, and not just even the use of one language, but the ability to speak in a particular accent somehow privileges certain groups of people over other groups of people. So that is what I mean by inequalities of multilingualism. That it is not just simply about the distribution of languages in society, but it's also about the hierarchy, of languages in society, and the impact of that hierarchy on the lives of people. So when I mentioned earlier about my personal experiences, it's really more about their engagement with you as a scholar. You come around and tell them, this is a kind of approach that we might need, because this is something that works in the classroom. And then they start telling you, well, it doesn't work here. This is what the students want, this is what the parents want. And even if these are fascinating theories, for example, at the end of the day, these theories have to come to terms with the realities of the classroom. So questions, riding a motorcycle with someone, for example, when I talk about, let's say, world Englishes, the fact that there are many different varieties and accents, when people speak English, and try to share this information with the teachers that you are working with, in while riding on a motorcycle with a teacher, I was suddenly told, I was suddenly taken aback by a comment by one teacher who is now a very good friend of mine, and said, Rwani, world English is a very, very fascinating field of study. But let me bring you to our classroom by the beach, all right, and observe what exactly do we need. At the end of the day, what I think he was trying to say is that, yes, these are social linguistic realities. These are, the different ways that we speak are things that we need to be concerned with. But when you get into the classroom, you have even more basic problems to be concerned about. Basic in terms of you just get them to probably write in sentences that will make them comprehensible, or you just make them experience the learning of English, because at the end of the day they're doing it not so much because they want to speak English, in their daily lives, because that's not the language of daily life, but basically because it's the language of school. So it's a question of priorities, I guess, that I'm saying here, that these personal comments that I got and I received from teachers from all over Southeast Asia, and I myself a teacher as well, so there was that kind of engagement. All of that basically had somehow fed back into my work, knowing that the theories and the methodologies that you think might work will have to contend with the daily realities or the messiness of the classroom in that sense.
That's very fascinating. I hadn't thought about language even in those terms or ways, or thinking that language can be used as a tool, to communicate, but also maybe people are learning a different language to get them somewhere else and so forth. I guess this leads in nicely to my next question, too. Do you find that more people are speaking English over traditional language, in particular, maybe in the Philippines? Some people would argue that perhaps that's due to globalization, or us consuming lots of Hollywood movie and things like that. What do you think?
Well, there is definitely a push. Again, my travels in Southeast Asia, and I guess also my own reading of research on other regions in the world, basically tell me that there is definitely a push towards English. And even in the context of the Philippines, there is an increasing, again, pressure to reintroduce English as a sole medium of instruction, for example. So when you talk about English, you're talking about this, what we might call the symbolic power of English, that it is a language that is desirable because it is supposedly the language that will help people get jobs, people will, that give them access to many different privileges in society. And that is where, of course, my own research comes in, because a lot of these, desires for English, while they are legitimate,
Mhm.
when these actually come face to face with reality, so to speak, meaning, the daily needs and realities of people, you will find out that there is a need for more languages. There's a need for encouraging people to use their own local languages as well, because these are languages that can facilitate learning, that facilitate literacy development as well. So there is definitely that push towards English, this desire towards English, because of that, what I referred to earlier as the symbolic power of the language. But it also needs to be, in a sense, viewed in the context of whether or not everybody who learns English or who wants to learn English actually benefits from it. Because that by itself, access to the learning of English is also unequal. So, in a sense, the desire to learn the language is definitely a legitimate desire, but the actual learning of the language and the resources that you have to put into the learning of English are not equal when it comes to, groups of people and communities. So there is also that kind of inequality or unequal access to the learning of the language too, which also exacerbates inequalities as well, because language is part of social, what you might call different forms of social inequality too.
Yeah, so speaking of access and also, engaging with new audiences, do you have any ideas in terms of how we should best engage new audiences and make linguistics more accessible to them?
Well, that's where my work in Filipino or Pinoy pop music comes into the picture. I think we are not really just simply talking of hundreds of people in this particular community. We're talking in terms of thousands of people in this community. And my experience is that these are people who have the potential to have a great impact on transforming education, not just in the Philippines, but actually also anywhere else in the world, because these are the people who are very much in tune with contemporary pop culture. And so looking at what they do, how they engage, let's say in social media, the kinds of thinking that get into the conversations and communication online or offline is to me really something that is fascinating, but it's something that is not accessible yet in terms of what we know about the young. And that's where I come in, because when I came into this community, it's not because I wanted to do research. I was really just simply fascinated with the work. I have three children. I wanted to know more about their interests. And to cut the story short, I got interested myself in Filipino pop music, and things, somehow developed in a way that I became, a stan of one of the, you might call a stan in one of the Filipino groups at this right now, which is called SB19. It's one of the most formidable Filipino groups at this point. So I was following them not so much as a researcher. I was following them as a father. I was following them as someone who has eyes open as to what they can offer me, as an educator. And then at the end of the day, I realized that when you actually participate in their conversations, and I was legitimately participating in their conversations and dialogues every day, there are just so many language issues that they engage in as well. So I told myself, somehow I should try making sense of what's going on. And I think it works very well with my own research as well, because in the end, my perspective on research is that you don't impose on communities what you think they should be doing. You start from listening to them, you start from hearing voices from the community. What are the kinds of debates? What are the kinds of conversations? And you start from there. So, going back to your question, I think that's the first thing. I think we need to immerse ourselves in communities. It doesn't have to be the Filipino pop music culture or community. Any community is always a speaking and talking and listening community or communicating community. I think that's the first thing that we should do as scholars in the field, to just simply feel what's going out there, what's going on in these communities, and start from there instead of going in already with your own understanding of what they should be doing.
I really like that tip of, going into the community, listening to what people have to say, and before even making any kind of judgment or anything like that. Sounds like you're also a really cool dad and you're getting into all the things that, your children are exposed to and the culture there as well. Do you think P-pop is another way for people to reach out to learn more about their culture and also mother tongue?
Yes, I can give you two examples. One, of course, is because people, come together, stans come together, let's say online or offline. And, a lot of these stans or fans, if you call them that speak different Philippine languages, really. And so what happens really is that when you analyze the kinds of conversations and dialogues,
Hmm.
that we participate in these conversations, it's not just English, or it's not just the national language, which is Filipino. It's a combination of English and Filipino, and then they infuse them with different Philippine languages. And what is fascinating here, of course, is that there are times when, let's say, members of SB19 would you speak in a Philippine language that is not as used, in other words, as, let's say, English and Filipino, which is the national language. And yet people come together and try to figure out, what does it mean? What exactly did, let's say, Ken Susan of SB19 say? And then, the kinds of strategies that they engage in just to, continue the conversation. So, of course, those who are, let's say, speakers of that language would help others explain what it is. Those who don't speak the language will go and look for their parents or their friends or boyfriends or girlfriends who speak that language for help. Some also would draw on their own knowledge of their own other Philippine languages because there are similarities and coming together. I think the point here really is that the language issue, the language used or the languages used did not become barriers to communication, but that even if initially they did not understand each other, there is like a pool of resources and energies coming together trying to understand each other. And I think that to me is really fascinating, because when you are actually outside these communities, talking about language policy and so on, people will always say, oh, let's only have one language in this society, let's only have one or two languages, because the more languages we speak, the more difficult it is for people to communicate. But actually, on the ground, that's not the point. If there is a desire to understand each other, languages do not really matter as much. It is your attitudes towards people. If you want to know more about people, definitely you will find ways. So, language barriers really are just simply probably initial challenges in communication, but they do not really pose a great challenge, at least as far as these conversations on the ground are concerned. So, I think that to me is fascinating information and some knowledge that needs to feed back into education as well and policy making.
I definitely agree with you. It sounds like, instead of seeing language or multiple different languages that we may not understand as barriers, it's so important that we actually see them as opportunities to learn more about others or go and find out different ways to learn more about the certain culture.
There's another one that has just come up on one group, which is Alamat. And the group is a multilingual group. It was formed, it now has 9 members. It was formed by bringing together 9 different artists from different regions in the country. And so their advocacy is promoting Philippine music through the different languages that we speak. And I think that to me is something that I am very much interested in personally and as a researcher, because now I am seeing different emotions coming out in comments, different like feelings of excitement of being, just some a few sentences, how it feels, how effective and emotional one could get listening to someone's language that hasn't been heard in music, that hasn't been heard in songs being played on air, and now suddenly you have this particular song or this particular group that sings in different languages. And so that's also another fascinating development right now in Philippine music, where there is very much more interest. There's a developing interest in Filipino music in other Philippine languages.
That's incredible. Definitely sounds like it's going to bring more people together in the community as well. I'm going to try and look up some of these groups and check them out later as well. Now to my final question of the interview. I guess, this past year has been really difficult for people. And I guess, my question now relates more to people learning another language as we spoke about. Do you think the best way to learn a new language are these, language apps that we know that we can all get on our phones and stuff? Is that the best way, or is there another way that you think is better?
Well, there are many ways, and I can actually share with you what my wife and I have done for the past year, being in 3 lockdowns in London. Uh, yeah, yeah, and in fact, that the past year, precisely because much of the work, much of communication has been online for me and the kids. I actually took the opportunity for me to introduce them to language learning online, and I did not even use softwares. I use songs. And so songs, for example, in Philippine languages, songs, and even in English, and but also Filipino and Philippine languages. So in a sense, it helped address so many things while you are being stuck in the house. One is you get to let them, learn words in the language or in these different languages. Number two, you get to let them learn by enjoying the learning of these languages instead of just giving them all the grammar. I think sensitizing them, making them comfortable with the language through the music is something that I think we really need to look into. And another thing, of course, is through music. It's one of those things that you could do at home, because it's for the past many weeks it has been really very very cold outside as well. So you can't go out, and aside from the fact that there are certain restrictions, what kept them going basically is music. What kept them going is singing in these different languages, and it's something that they don't really resist, because it's something that excites them too. Um, so it's hitting, like, in a sense, so many birds with one stone. Their mental health, learning the language, and also learning about the Philippine culture. And I think that to me can also happen in other contexts too. And for me, it didn't feel like, and for my wife, it didn't feel like we are doing any work at all. We're just all singing together.
That's a really good suggestion. And I'm sure you guys are good singers too. That's why. Not sure if I'll get the same effect if I was singing. But Ruanni, it has been really interesting talking with you. I learned a lot. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast and sharing your work and insights. We wish you well with your research.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kerry. I also enjoyed, talking to you and sharing my experiences as, as a researcher and as a father too. So thank you very much. It's been a privilege to be with you.
That's amazing. You can follow Ruanni on Twitter at Tupas Ruanni, and you can learn more about his research via the links in the episode notes. We've had some fascinating guests on the podcast, a real variation in topics and expertise across social science and education. Search IOE Podcast from wherever you get your podcasts, and to find episodes from seasons 1 to 8 of Research for the Real World, as well as more podcasts from the IOE. And if it's a musical interlude you're after, there's a Spotify playlist too, featuring songs chosen by our guests and the IOE podcast team. I'm sure Ruanni is going to add a couple of SB19 tracks too. All that is available on our website. Just search Research for the Real World. I'm Keri. See you next time.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.